Hello, welcome everyone. Hope you're all still with us. Thank you so much for taking the time to attend this talk. My name is Shayna. I'm a member of the Atlassian team, just here to kick things off. It's my pleasure to introduce Jonno to all of you, who's going to be leading today's session. A quick fun fact about Jonno is that last week he was in a small town in Spain with about 20,000 people throwing tomatoes at one another called La Tomatina. So if you want more stories about that, you can ask him after. But in the meantime, he's going to talk to you a little bit about roadmap planning with Portfolio. So take it away.
Awesome. Thanks, Shayna. And yeah, anyone who hasn't done La Tomatina, I definitely recommend it once in your life, but probably not twice. So yeah, my name is Jonno. Today I'm going to be talking to you about how my team, the Portfolio for Jira team, builds out our roadmap. And as a bit of clarification, the talk is very much going to be process-based, so the thinking and the best practice that we've learned from working with customers and building a road mapping tool around how we think about road mapping. So any technical questions around the nitty-gritty of Portfolio itself, feel free to come and have a chat to me after the talk, and I'd be more than happy to discuss that with you. So we're going to take you back a couple of years before becoming a product manager at Atlassian, and this is a photo of me, two years ago. And at this point in time, I was pretty blissfully unaware, just smiling dumbly about my lack of knowledge around what sets apart an effective roadmap from an ineffective one. And at its core, I thought that a roadmap was essentially what you see on the screen, just a list of features to build with some dates attached, but I didn't really think there was much more to it. What I quickly realized was that the road mapping process and the way that we think about building out a roadmap is quite a nuanced craft, and it comes down to thinking really clearly about your long term and getting those foundations set before you start to think about what ends up on your annual roadmap if you do one. So I learned a lot of these things when I joined this merry band of misfits on the screen behind me, the Portfolio for Jira team, and it probably doesn't come as too much of a surprise that living, breathing, and thinking about roadmaps, talking to customers every day about roadmaps has taught us a number of lessons and best practices around what makes an effective roadmap or what helps to make a roadmap successful. And today, my aim is to really give you a window into some of these learnings and some of the ways that we utilize these learnings to build out our own roadmap and get to a place where we ship value to customers. So I'm going to start off by talking about the framework that we've recently utilized across all of Atlassian to get really clear on where our product teams are going over the next 3 years, so getting long-term clarity. I'll then talk about how we break that down and start to think about the year directly ahead of us, and this is more so the typical one-year roadmap, and how we think about this in a way that feeds directly into that longer-term direction, and how we have these 3 criteria that we try to tick off, that being that our roadmap is focused, aligned, and flexible. I'll explain what that means a little later on in the talk. And then lastly, I'm going to talk to you about potentially the most important point that a lot of people miss, and it's the importance of performing regular sense checks and why my team is constantly going back to the drawing board and looking at any new information we have and asking ourselves if we're being realistic or not with what we're planning on our roadmap. And I'll walk you through a bit of our thinking and the process we go through to do that. So let's kick off with the first thing that we do. And I wonder if I asked anyone in any of your teams to describe where your product or your team was heading in the next 3 to 5 years, what they'd tell me. Would they really clearly describe where your product was heading, your vision, your strategy, what success looks like, or would they just have no idea and pass me off to someone else because they honestly don't know? Now, whatever your response to this question is, it's really crucial to understand the importance of having some form of a mechanism to create a really clear shared understanding about where your product is heading in the next 3 to 5 years to ensure that your team has focus and other teams have clarity about what you will be inherently working on in the year directly ahead of you when you start to work on that one-year roadmap. Now, I know this is crucial because up until last year, teams at Atlassian weren't great at doing this ourselves. If you'd asked a similar question to the one on the screen behind me about where are you heading to any product team at Atlassian, you'd get sent to 1,000,001 different places on Confluence, and you'd basically have to piece together the information you needed to get an understanding of where their product was heading. And essentially there was no clear consistent, common language that we had as product teams at Atlassian, not just portfolio, but all product teams at Atlassian, to explain to our own team, but also other teams, where our products were heading and what made sense to then end up on that 1 year roadmap for us. So things had to change, and luckily enough, they did late last year. We introduced this simple, clear, consistent one-page resource called a VSO to describe our 3-year plans. And a VSO really simply stands for vision, strategy, and objectives. And the point of a VSO is in a single page to get really, really, really clear and focused on where your product is heading, how you plan on getting there, and what success looks like at the end of the day. And I'll break down in more detail what this actually would look like for us in Confluence and on a page. To do that, I would have loved to have shown you my team's VSO, but as we've only just started doing that, legal, we're not too keen on me showing everyone our 3-year VSO. So instead, I'm going to use a hypothetical example of a company I've just made up called Galaxy. So Galaxy, think very SpaceX-y, currently is a space transportation company, takes freight to and from, say, the International Space Station, and now they're looking at creating a new product line, an awesome product line, to move into planetary tourism, so taking people like you and me for awesome trips into space. And the team at Galaxy are at the start of building out this product, and they're thinking about where they want to be in 3 years' time. So they come together and they try to get to a place like this, where they have, as you can see in Confluence, a really, really simple VSO. And I'll break down what this looks like and uncover some of those details. But as you can see, it's really short, it's really sharp, and the information on here is going to have to be pretty succinct. Now, the one thing to call out here is, as we're going through this process, it's not a one-man show. It's not me or our head of product that locks ourselves in a room with a bunch of caffeine for a week or two, and then comes back to the team and says, this is what we're doing. It's a really collaborative process that most members of our team, and also teams that we work closely with, have input in over a number of months. It's actually quite a long process to get to a place where we have that longer term focus and that longer term VSO. So breaking it down, we start off with the vision. And the vision is essentially what we aspire to be. It's a single, short, sharp sentence about where our product wants to be at the end of the 3 years. And its aim is really to inspire our team and get them all brought into this common aim. Now, anyone should be able to land on the VSO, read the vision, and in less than 10 seconds get a really clear understanding of, okay, this product is focusing on doing this thing and doing this thing really well, and nothing else. Once we have that vision, we then start to think about the strategy. And the strategy isn't steps to get to. It's not we do this one thing, then we do another thing, then we do another thing, and then we'll reach our vision. It's really an articulation of how we win, our strategic differentiators. And it manifests itself as generally, for each product, 3 to 5 really clear dot points that set out how we as a product are going to navigate the competitive environment and the competitive landscape in a way that will enable us to reach our vision. And again, you should be able to land on this in 10, 20 seconds, get a really clear view of how we are going to set ourselves apart and ensure that we get to that vision in 3 years' time. And the last thing that we think about is the objectives, and the objectives are really what success looks like for us. It's a quantitative measure that describes whether at the end of the day, in 3 years' time, whether we have successfully reached that vision and executed on that strategy. And it's broken down into 2 core components. There is an overarching goal, which is our big, hairy, audacious single metric that we have that will enable us at the end of the day to say, yes, we've been successful, or no, we haven't been successful in our vision. And then we have some sub-success measures, which are generally aligned to our strategy. And these are kind of check-in points for us to say, okay, we have this quantitative measure for us to see whether we have effectively navigated the competitive landscape and set ourselves apart in a way that we had planned to do so. So when it all comes together, this is what it looks like. And as you can see, within, I've said 10, 20, within 30 seconds, less than a minute, anyone should be able to read this. You should be able to send it to people in your own team, outside of your team, and they should very, very quickly understand what you aspire to be, how you plan on succeeding in your vision and what success looks like and how that all ties together. So my challenge to you, and I'm going to issue a number of challenges today. My first challenge is to ask yourselves, do you have a clear articulation of what your product aspires to be in the long term, how you win, how you plan on getting to that vision, and measurable goals, what success looks like. And if you don't, I think it's really, really important to start thinking about these things, because it is the foundational, the most important initial step to then enable you to effectively build out what most will think is that typical one-year roadmap. So if you don't, a couple of really quick things that you can do when you get back. The first thing is to document what you do have. Document anything that you do have about what you aspire to be, how you win, measurable goals that you have. Then centralize this in a place that from there you can start to collaborate with the rest of your team and start to work on getting to a point where you have a really clear, concise, consistent way of messaging in a singular page where your product is heading in the next 3 years, and give your team and other teams that focus about what will then inherently end up on your roadmap and what you'll end up building. So the second area I'm going to share with you is really focused on how we create our roadmap for the year directly ahead of us. And this is starting to think about the one-year roadmap, that typical prioritized list of things to do. And how at the beginning of each financial year, we sit down and we figure out what our plan for the year ahead looks like. We need to take our VSO, that 3-year plan, our longer term plan, and break it down into tangible things to actually work on in the coming years. So now the process of creating our one-year roadmap is a collaborative process that happens for us in 2 places. Firstly, we start off in Confluence, and here we include a lot of additional context, like what are the problems we're solving, what are the goals that we have, who's going to be, who from a product perspective, so a PM perspective, is responsible for owning that and really driving discovery of it. So we get into the nitty-gritty and add a lot of context there. And then once we have that, we break it down into initiatives. So we break down our problems into initiatives, which are, for those of you who don't use Portfolio, it's an issue level of hierarchy above an epic, and we put them into Portfolio and then have a visual way for us to start to break down the work and work with our engineering team to get to a point where we actually ship things to customers. So as we're going through this collaborative process, we aim to ensure that our one-year roadmap we come up with satisfies the 3 key criteria that you can see behind me on the screen, that it's focused, aligned, and flexible. Now what I mean by this, to give you context around each one, we firstly want to ensure that our roadmap is focused on what we want to achieve over the next year. So we really want to have a small group, and it's namely just one core North Star metric of clear goals for us to work on over the coming year and to focus all of our effort and resources on over the coming year. In terms of alignment, we want to ensure that it's aligned to our long-term plan. So everything that we do, everything that ends up on that one-year roadmap should feed directly into that 3-year plan that we have. And that's why I started off by describing that, because it's so crucial to get clear on that at the start. And then lastly, it needs to be flexible, and it needs to be flexible in the way that we deliver customer value. And the way that we do this is, instead of having a prioritized list of features to build, we actually build a roadmap that's a prioritized list of problems to solve. And the reason that we do that, I'll go into a bit more depth later, but the reason we do that is inherently people take features. If you say, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z over the next 12 months, they take it as commitment. So they say, you're going to work on this you're going to build this feature for our customer in 12 months' time. The challenge with that, though, is that how do we know now what is best for the customer now is going to be the same thing and the same feature that's best for them for that problem in 12 months' time? So many things can change. Generally, problems will remain, but the way that we build out those features and the way that we solve that problem can change, and it can change very quickly. So committing to a feature really kind of strangles you into this place that makes it hard to move. And secondly, technological change. We are consistently updating the way that we build products. Even our team has started using a new front-end stack. So some of the things that we were planning 12 months ago, or we couldn't plan to build 12 months ago, are now a lot more viable because we're using a slightly different technical stack. So committing to a feature rather than committing to a problem is problematic and reduces that flexibility that our team has. So breaking down what that process looks like, as I mentioned before, it starts off in Confluence, and at the end of the day, it will look like something, as you can see on the screen behind me, and I'll uncover what some of that looks like shortly. And the two core parts to this are really the goals and the problems. So from a goals perspective, what our aim here is to create that focus. We have a singular North Star metric that our team works towards. So everything that we do should some way, shape, or form in that year feed into that goal. And it makes sure that we're utilizing our resources and our amazing developers in the best way and the most valuable way as possible. So as an example, last year for us, we used our North Star metric was to increase retention. And the reason we did that was we thought that by increasing retention, it would mean that we inherently would be driving more customer value because they'd be staying around for longer. So everything that we did was focused on driving some form of retention. Once we had that focus for the year, we ensured that it aligned to our one-year company goals. So at Atlassian, we have a small set of quantitative company goals. So everything we do needed to feed into those, but also that, as I mentioned, it feeds into those three-year product goals in the VSO, those objectives in the VSO. So we have that focus. We now know what we're going to be doing in the year ahead and what we're going to be trying to achieve in the year ahead. And it's now time for us to think about, okay, how do we move towards achieving that goal? And we do this by thinking about problems. So we break down a list of core problems to solve. The list is much longer than this. If I was to scroll down on that page, you'd see a lot more detail. But we essentially have a list of problems. A couple here were around scope table, which is a spreadsheet-like view of Jira issues in our product, and also Jira integration. So once we have that, we then build out that additional context that I mentioned, so loose timings, why it's important. We try to go into depth about why we're actually doing something, the status of it, who owns it from a product perspective, not so much from a dev perspective, any dependencies, questions, notes, comments, and this is where we start to have a conversation in some form of a historical format. Once we have this, we then rip out those problems and we get to a point where we then start to think about the visual roadmap itself. And we create initiatives for each of those problems. So an initiative being that high level issue type above an epic in portfolio for Jira. And from here we can then start to think about breaking down the work and get a visual understanding and discuss with our team where things are probably going to land for us and potential trade-off decisions we have to start thinking about. Now, when I walk through this process, a common question I get is, how do we decide on those problems to actually focus on? My response is it's a repetitive one. We ask this question over and over again, and it's what are the things that we believe will have the biggest positive impact on our goals. So for us last year, the question we asked over and over again was what are the things that we believe will have the biggest positive impact on retention, that goal for the year, the North Star metric. So to find out what they were, we did a bunch of customer research. We went and looked at feedback channels, support channels, in-app feedback, in-app usage. We did customer interviews, and from collating all of this data from customers, we came to a point where one of the things that we found was there's this thing in portfolio called the scope table. And for those non-portfolians in the room, the scope table is like a spreadsheet-like view of your Jira issues that allows you to wrangle and work with data really, really quickly and change Jira issues really, really quickly. Now, one of the things that we learned is that there were actually some usability challenges that the customers were having that was quite an annoyance, frankly. So from that, we hypothesized that if we were to improve scope table usability, we would in turn improve retention, that one-year goal. So scope table usability became a problem for us to solve, a prioritized problem for us to solve in the year, and became one of our line items on our roadmap. And then we repeated this process over and over again until we had a reasonable and a viable amount of problems to work on during the year for our one-year roadmap. So with that said, I want you to think about your own roadmaps and to issue my second challenge and wonder if it looks something similar to this. Is it just that prioritized list of features to build, things that you've committed to your execs that you're going to ship in 12 months' time? And do you even have any goals that provide that focus for the team? And if not, when you get back from Summit, I really, really encourage you to think about firstly sitting down and coming up with some measurable goals to work on during the year to bring that focus to your team around where you're actually going to utilize your resources to deliver customer value. And then once you have that, I want you to put these goals beside your roadmap and do an audit of sorts and think and ask yourselves, do the features that we have align directly to the goals that we've now set ourselves? And for any that don't, I want you to do this. Or I'm going to challenge you to do this anyway. I can't force you to do anything. Think about doing that. And the reason why I think it's a good idea is because what is the point on working on things and utilizing and spending time, money, engineering resources on something that isn't actually delivering value for you in a way that you're for the direction that you're heading? That's the first thing I want you to think about is ensuring that you're utilizing the resources for something that actually makes sense for your team and takes you towards that place, the top of the mountain that you're really aiming to go towards. And then for the next year, I want you to think about doing this. When you're building out your next annual roadmap, instead of thinking about features, think about those problems and really create flexibility for your team to deliver customer value in a way that makes sense for the team when you come about to actually working on those things. And don't hamstring yourselves and get locked into these committed features that may not make sense to the customer, but you just ship anyway because you've told your CEO that that's what you're going to do. So the last tactic and the last thing that I'm going to speak to is the importance of performing regular sense checks and regularly going back to the drawing board and asking yourselves whether our roadmap is realistic or not. As I do that, I want to bring your attention to this pretty awesome tweet that I found as I was scrolling through Twitter the other day. And it went something along the lines of, "No agile framework can save you from unrealistic expectations." Now, I bloody love this quote. And the reason I love this quote is because I think it speaks to this really common anti-pattern where teams think that because they're now agile, they immediately can do some miraculous amount of work that is basically inhuman. You don't. You don't go to bed a waterfall team, wake up, roll out of bed as a Scrum team, and suddenly go, great, I can now do 5 times the amount of work with the resources I have. I wish it was that easy, but it's not. The use and the effectiveness of agile is really about learning and creating efficiencies in your process rather than immediately making you superhuman in your dev capabilities. And the only way that you create these efficiencies and ensure that you're learning and you're actually taking advantage of agile is if you're realistic with what you can actually build and what ends up on that roadmap. Now, the reason this is the case is quite closely aligned to this old school project management concept called the iron triangle of planning. And the iron triangle of planning basically speaks to the fact that there are 3 key pillars or core components to a plan or a roadmap, if you will, that you need to make trade-off decisions about and are your main constraints. And they are your scope, so the amount of work that you have to do, the time that you have to do that work, and the resources or the people, the developers that you have to complete that work within. And if one of those things changes, you need to make a trade-off decision about the others to ensure that your roadmap stays realistic. So as an example, you lose a developer, they leave for another company, you then need to start to think about, okay, we don't have as many people to work on this thing. We either are going to reduce the amount of work that is within our scope, or we're going to increase the amount of time that it's going to take to get to that place. And to do the work. And you need to be really, really honest with yourselves about this. Now, to sort of articulate what this looks like and why we're constantly looking at new information is because there is always new information. As we go along the track of building out a product, we are always learning about new things. So as an example, we think about if we're shipping a product in 12 months' time. 12 months away from shipping it, we don't know much. We know the problem we're solving, and we know at a very high level loosely how long that problem is going to take to work on. Then 3 months out from working and shipping that product, we know some more information around who will probably be working on it, team members will start taking leave, so we'll have a better understanding of team capacity that we should feed into our roadmap. How we're going to solve the problem, we'll start to think about that. If it's super, super complex and it's going to take ages, then we need to have a conversation with our team if we can even do it, or if we're going to have to sacrifice something else on the roadmap. And then 2 weeks out from working on it, we know most things. We have a pretty bloody clear picture about what we're doing. So we know who's going to be working on it. We know pretty solid estimate of what that looks like. We have a pretty clear understanding of when we think that will ship based off those estimates. So we have a lot more information at our disposal. Now, as we go through this process, we need to realize that information is pure gold. And that information is what ensures that our roadmap is realistic or not. And we need to recalibrate, pull that information into our roadmap, and start to think about, okay, with what we now know, what are the changes, what are the trade-off decisions, what are those levers that we have to pull to get to a place where we're not overcommitting and under-delivering. So for us as a portfolio team, the cadence that we do this at is threefold. Firstly, we have a forcing function, which is sprint planning. Sprint planning, although it's very much focused on what's coming in the next 2 weeks, we're a Scrum team with 2-week iterations. Although it's focused on the next 2 weeks, it's a great way for us to get eyes over our plan and think about any new information that we have and feed that into our roadmap and make any tweaks to our roadmap and enter that data into portfolio to see what our roadmap will then look like. Oh, sorry, I jumped ahead. Come on. There we go. The second forcing function is a monthly roadmap review that we have with a number of product teams at Atlassian, again focused on the last month and the couple of months ahead of us, but another great time for us to put our eyes over the roadmap. And lastly, building up a muscle around performing ad hoc sense checks. So whenever we get new information that is important, we realize will have an impact, like we get new headcount, we lose someone on the team, someone decides to go on leave and locks that leave in, we immediately go back to our roadmap and start to think about, okay, what impact is this going to have and what do we need to shuffle around and who do we need to tell about these changes so that we have set expectations to be as realistic as possible. The last thing that we do in this regard is we try to bring an objective opinion to this. It's really easy. Talk to a lot of product managers, sorry for any PMs in the room, that will tell you they know exactly when things are going to ship. And that is largely, because I do it myself, is largely a biased opinion. So we use Portfolio to do this, and Portfolio, for those of you who don't know, has an algorithm which takes into account those 3 pillars from the iron triangle of planning around scope, so the amount of work, your Jira issues, and the associated estimates, the time that you have the releases, the fixed versions for those, and the resources, the people that you have, so your team's capacity and velocity, and then some other variables like dependencies and sprint assignments. And it basically feeds this information into your plan and then comes back to you, and it generally tells our team this: mate, you're planning too much work. And this is a really great way for us to pull back on the reins and say, okay, we're being overly ambitious. It's great to be ambitious, but there's a fine line to tread. Being a bit too ambitious and that we need to make some form of a change. So what this looks like in Portfolio, there's a number of different views that this comes up in, but what this looks like for us, say, we're talking here just at a sprint level for visual representation. Each of those vertical bars is an individual sprint. So the green is the capacity that we've said our team has in the tool, so 33 story points, we estimate in story points, and the red part is what Portfolio has calculated we have overbooked. So it's saying that you have actually added 11 story points, too much work to this sprint. You need to go away, check yourselves basically, and think about what are the changes that you need to make to ensure that you're not telling people you're going to ship something and you end up not doing it. So this is a great way for us to get a bit of a slap in the face and say, okay, we need to think about what we're doing. So my third challenge to you today is pretty simple. It's to reassess if your roadmap is realistic or not. And however you do that, if you use Portfolio and you have questions about how we do things on a deeper level, come and have a chat to me. But if not, still go back to your roadmap and start to think about all of that new data, that new info that you have at your disposal and how that's going to impact your roadmap. And try to build up that muscle of realizing that you need to constantly be recalibrating and iterating your roadmap with that new information on hand. And try not to be that team that says they're going to ship the world and they don't even come close. So that's bringing us close to the end of my talk, and our journey today has really been me talking through some of our key road mapping steps and specifically our processes and our way of thinking about how we build out a roadmap. And I started by describing how we think about the year, and we set those foundations. Set those foundations for ourselves for our 3-year plan and how we get really, really clear and focused and concise on where our product is heading in the next 3 years. And how we do this by using a VSO to articulate our vision, our strategy, and our objectives. And then how we put this into a shareable resource that anyone can use to get on the same page, both within our teams but also outside of our teams. And then I spoke about how we take that 3-year VSO and that 3-year focus that we have now created for ourselves, and we break it down into tangible things to actually work on, and how we try to build out a 1-year roadmap that satisfies the 3 key criteria of being focused, aligned, and flexible, and how we do this by starting off in Confluence and then moving that information to Portfolio and articulating at the start our goals, so our North Star metric for the year, to ensure that all of our engineering resources are spent in the best way possible and aren't spread too thin. And then secondly, how we break down a list of prioritized problems, not a list of features, and we don't get into this habit of committing to things that may not be the best thing for the customer when we get there. And then the last thing that I touched upon was potentially the most important, that being the importance of performing regular sense checks and getting into the habit of performing regular sense checks, and why we as a team are constantly going back to the drawing board and asking ourselves, are we being realistic or not in what we are delivering and what we're planning on shipping to customers, and how we do that through a number of forcing functions, through sprint planning, through roadmap reviews, and also having built up that muscle around just ad hoc reviews, but also how we bring an objective opinion, an unbiased opinion through Portfolio to tell us whether we're probably aiming a little bit too high. So I'm going to leave you with a final challenge, and my final challenge is quite simple. It's to run a road mapping retro of sorts when you get back to your teams after Summit. And what I mean by this is, go back to your teams and have a conversation around the things that I've talked to you about today. Start to think about whether any of the things that we've discussed that we use as the Portfolio team would make sense for your teams. And if not, that's completely fine. But the important thing is to have a conversation and bring your whole team into the road mapping process, and speak to the things that over the past couple of years you've liked, you've lacked, you've learned about your road mapping process, and improvements that you can make. And the reason why I think this is such a crucial conversation is because at the end of the day, your roadmap is so central. It is the crux, it is the core of what you end up shipping to customers and what you end up spending those finite, invaluable resources that you have to build out customer value. So it's really worth the time and the investment to think through what ends up on that roadmap and the process that you utilize to build out that roadmap. So with that, I'm going to open it up to questions. Thank you all so much. If I haven't met any of you, which I'm sure I haven't met the majority of you, please come and say hi to me at the Portfolio for Jira booth. I'd love to have a chat. Thank you.
If anyone has a question, just raise your hand. I'll bring a mic to you.
My name is Dennis. I'm wondering, what source you're also showing to your stakeholders? Are you telling them to look for Confluence, to dive in our vision or strategy, or go to Portfolio to dive in what we are building now, the current period. What's the source what you're telling them to?
Yeah, so for a really high-level view, if they just want a quick glance at, okay, they're working on these things, this is when it's going to land, we direct them to portfolio. When we start to think about, okay, why are we doing certain things, and they want that additional context, we then send them to Confluence to say this is our thinking behind why we're doing those things. So it's kind of a two-pronged attack.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
It's a great question.
Back.
Thank you. One thing we struggle with a little bit in our company is trying to how to size certain things in Jira and in portfolio. So with respect to, so it looks like your problems you turn into initiatives, so that's about a year you're looking at. So do you do similar things with your epics as well to say, okay, we try to deliver an epic or make an epic a certain size so it can be delivered in a specific time range?
Yeah, so our initiatives are actually quite a lot smaller than that. So our initiatives are in generally months, so up like three-ish months. And then we start to think about epics as being like one-ish month or less, and then a story following. We're not super hygienic about our agile practices, but in terms of estimating stories, we try to ensure that a story can be completed in a singular iteration, a singular sprint. So that's 2 weeks or less for us. No worries. Yes?
So there's sometimes a chicken and egg problem between estimation and road mapping, right? You need to estimate something to know whether it's achievable. You need to know whether it's achievable to know if it's something you can do.
Yeah.
How do you handle that? How do you sort of reconcile the chicken egg problem there?
Yeah, I think, firstly, great question. I think the first thing to think about is setting expectations. So for us, and going back to that conversation around commitment, getting really clear that this is not set in stone. Even when we set out that list of prioritized problems, it's these things can change. Like, we are going to do the best thing for the customer and with the resources that we have. So firstly, these things are going to change, and we're going to constantly look at how we decisions that we make to move that around. But at the start, we generally start by estimating at a really, really high level, and it's generally like we have a target start date and a target end date. Sometimes we'll use a pretty broad, wild guess of an estimate for an epic, and then as we start to get more information and an initiative, and as we start to get more information, like I mentioned, we go back and we start to feed that into our roadmap and have conversations around, okay, what are the changes that we need to make to ensure that we're doing the right thing. So yeah, it starts off with being really, really clear that things are going to change. Secondly, we start off with a very high level estimate that we know is not accurate, but we know it's kind of the time that we plan on spending it. So as an example, we could say we want to work for 2.5 months on this initiative, and we're going to dedicate that amount of resources, whoever actually ends up working on it for that amount of time, and then we break it down from there.
Also, secondarily to that, we're going to have a whole talk on estimations tomorrow. So I would check that out if you're interested.
Yeah, and that might be different to, I don't know who's doing that talk.
Steve Haffenden.
Okay, yeah, a lot of teams at Atlassian do it so differently. Yeah.
Thank you. In terms of roadmap and when you're tracking the objectives or strategic goals, how do you measure your estimates? How are you, within Atlassian, for any of the objectives, how do you actually, put the budgeting around that? And in a given point of time, if you are trying to look at your objectives, how it is progressing, will you be able to see, what is the amount spent and what is the, delta remaining? How within Atlassian you do that for your objectives?
Right. So the question is to clarify is how do we track our objectives and how much time we spend on each of those in terms of estimation?
Yeah, one is time spent, but
Yep.
the other one is that, let's say dollar value. If you have this is what your estimated budget is for that objective, and how do you track where you are with the budget?
Right. Okay. So generally what it comes down to for our team is around our budget is basically headcount. So when we do that VS, when we created the VSO for the first time at the end of last year, beginning of this year, it then goes to, we have feedback sessions with the founders, so Scott and Mike, and then they take it, the heads of our business unit take it to the board and say, to do this, we want this amount of heads, this amount of headcount this year, and then they'll either give us that amount, they won't give us any, or they'll give us some amount. And that's basically our budget. So then we don't really have dollar amounts, it's more you just have this amount of people to work on successfully moving towards nailing whatever the objective that we've set ourselves. So for us as a team, as a portfolio team, it's not really money that we're spending this amount, and it seems to work pretty well. So yeah.
I have really two questions. First,
Okay.
how you keep, how you prioritize
Yes.
your initiatives and how you ensure that during execution of them, the prioritization is still kept?
Okay, great question. So how we prioritize, we use a number of factors. So recently for something that I've been working on, I started off at a really, really high level to, as you probably know with product teams, you have 1,000,001 things that you want to do, and then you want to start to narrow it down to the smaller group of things that you then can start to choose what you want to work on. So I used a framework called RICE, which is reach, I'm now blanking, reach, complexity, effort, and I don't remember what the third one or the fourth one is, but there's a framework online that Intercom, you should look it up. We just used their template for it, and it gave us a quantitative measure that was, take it with a grain of salt, but it allowed us to basically then just squash that list down to a grouping of things to then start to think about in more depth. Then once we had that list, we then started to think about, okay, biggest customer pain points, what resources do we have, dependencies. I work on Portfolio Cloud, so we have a lot of dependencies on platform teams. So there are some things that are super, super, super high priority for us as a team, but we rely on someone else. So we then have to take a bit of a gut check and say, okay, this probably isn't viable now, but down the track. So it's a bit of an inaccurate science. We take into it's kind of like just logical factors that we think about. Sorry.
And technically you keep this prioritization, however you score it in Jira portfolio or in Confluence or so?
So the way that we score it it's not a field in Portfolio. So the way that we score it is literally just in Confluence or in a spreadsheet. And then in terms of keeping the priority further down the track, we, again, based on any new information that we learn, we say, this is what we're planning on doing now, but a roadmap is essentially, think of it like guidelines. It can always change. So if things change, then we are realistic with ourselves and say, okay, this is probably going to need to move, and we move it.
You mentioned as well something related to my second question, so the dependency on other teams.
Sorry?
Are there even
Dependencies,
dependency
yes, yeah.
between other teams, not even inside your program, but as well for example other programs? How you handle it?
How do we handle it? We are, as an organization, like we work pretty closely. We have what, 2,500-ish people. So we're pretty fortunate in that the teams that we work closely with, we have quite, in terms of location, we have quite close access, and those that we don't, we work with on Blue Jeans or on Zoom. So we just try to bring them all together into a room and have a conversation around what those dependencies are, and we have weekly update meetings to ensure that we're all on the same page. We send them our roadmap, our portfolio roadmap. We also mention them on, a great tip is, if you know that you're going to be dependent on someone, just mention them immediately on if you have a page, a Confluence page, mention it on the page, set their expectations, get them in the loop as early as possible. And also another tip is to bring them into, say, you know that you have a dependency that you're going to need to encourage or to convince to work with you further down the track. Bring them into your discovery sessions and really try to create some form of ownership from their perspective that they're part of this journey. And by doing that, it makes it a lot easier down the track to then to get help from that person. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone, for your questions. If you have more, feel free to come up and chat with Jonno after, but we're a little over time, so thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.